Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. Let me check my microphone settings, make sure I'm using the right microphone. Yep, okay, everything looks good. Hi, I'll wait a minute or two for some people to join us. It's nice to see everyone tonight. Thank you for joining. Oh, thank you, Miss McGann, for letting me know you can hear me. Oh, we have somebody coming into Zoom now. Also, we have a few people joining us, so let's wait a couple of minutes for people to join us here. Make sure I stay current in the Zoom meeting. It's nice to see everyone. I hope everyone had a great week. We're going to have a really fun topic tonight. Anyway, I hope you think it's fun. I think it's fun. I had quite a nice week myself. Getting ready for some special events coming up in November and December. Hi, everyone. Oh, I see a bunch of regulars here tonight. It's great to see you. And I have a lot of great things to show you tonight, but let's get to my first background I want to use, which is right there. And just to remind you that if you're enjoying my work as Mrs. Q and you can't make it on one of my tours, please consider making a donation to my Mrs. Q project. And here you can donate at PayPal at paypal.me or on Venmo as well. So if you're enjoying Mrs. Q Live, please consider making a little donation to help support my work here. Let's see who's here. Oh, lots of people here tonight. It's so good to see everyone. A couple of things that are coming up, if you don't know already. Next Friday, I will not be here in the evening because I will be doing my monthly lecture for the Queens Public Library. So that will be, I think, at 10 a.m. New York time, but I'll be posting on social media and sending out email. Sometimes the time of that presentation changes, so I'm not sure. But that will be next Friday, sometime in the morning, 10 or 11 a.m. Eastern time. And then, of course, next Sunday, I hope you'll all be joining me for a live tour of St. Paul's Chapel and Trinity Church graveyards. And that's going to begin Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Those of you in the New York area, you are welcome to come out and join me. We'll be meeting in front of St. Paul's at 1 p.m. It'll be live streaming at 1 p.m. Of course, that's New York time. And there is no charge for this tour. I'm kind of experimenting a little bit, and this is a pay what you'd like tour. So at the end of the tour, you can tip Mrs. Q for what you thought the tour was worth to you. So I'm going to experiment with these kind of pay-as-you-wish tours. The same on the live stream. So on the live stream, I will be posting these links so that if you're watching, you can send me a tip to thank me for all of the hard work I'm putting into putting together this graveyard tour for next week. And oh, I had it right here. I just got a few yards of some nice black cotton fabric for something special I'll be making to wear on that tour. So that'll be a great time, and it will be lots of fun walking through the graveyards together. And I do believe that Mr. Hamilton is going to be out at about the same time doing a tour. So maybe we'll run into Mr. Hamilton on that tour. You look at some of your comments. Oh, we have people from everywhere. It's so great to see this. And somebody was at both churches earlier today. That's great. I was not in Manhattan today. I was doing some other things here, more locally in Queens. Also coming up, before I forget, November is Evacuation Day, and I think there's going to be a big Evacuation Day parade the day after Thanksgiving on November 25th, and that will be in Lower Manhattan. And I'm still talking to various groups about who I'll be joining, but I will be out on Friday, November 25th for Evacuation Day with at least one of the groups that's marching. I'm not sure which one. I'll tell you more about that. And on December 17th is Wreaths Across America. And for the second year in a row, I will be at the Dutch Reformed Church of Staten Island. You might know, one of the oldest churches in New York City. And I will be presenting a wreath as Mrs. Q at that. And I hope I'm going to be joined by some members of the Sons of the American Revolution for that. So that will be really nice. So just some of the upcoming events, but more directly next Sunday. I hope to see you all either live and in person at St. Paul's Chapel or on Facebook and YouTube for the live stream. So tonight's topic is, I'm going to change my background here. Give me a moment. Tonight's tonight's topic, I should say, is, let me fix my chair. Also, Mr. Q is busy and I had to prepare the whole set tonight by myself. So I'm a little out of sorts, not as well coordinated as usual. Okay, this is much better. You can see the exhibit here. Tonight's topic is taxes, taxes, and more taxes. And what are those taxes all about? And is taxation theft? And we're going to talk about that tonight and talk about what we thought about it in my time in New York City in the 18th century. And the first tax we're going to be talking about, I hope you all remember it, is the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act was a tax on all of the paper we used. So if I was going to write a letter to my sister, Mrs. Van R., it had to be on the stamped paper. All of my business documents would be on stamped paper. The ship manifest for the goods for my shop on stamped paper. Any contracts, stamped paper. Diplomas, licenses, legal documents, everything printed, all on stamped paper. Oh, and for the gentlemen out there, playing cards and things like that, the package would also bear the stamp on the outside. So everything that we used to communicate was taxed, all of the paper, and thus the Stamp Act. And here's the first page of the Stamp Act, so you can see what it looked like. And this was, or the Parliament told us, to pay for the debt incurred for what we call the French Indian War, and I believe they call the 7 Years' War, in which they said they had to fight a war here on our behalf to protect us from the French, and as they called them, the savage Indians. Well, it's an interesting thing, but as far as I know, my family coming from the Hudson Valley as well as Mr. Q's family, people seem to have been getting along pretty well in the Hudson Valley and northern New York colony before the English and the French decided to exploit a rivalry between the Mohawk and the Huron and turn that into a battle for territory in the colony of New York and in Canada. And this turned into a large war that we today call the French and Indian War. So England said they had to fight that on our behalf. Little skepticism is needed there. And that because of that, they needed to keep troops here in order to protect us now. And of course, we should pay for some of that. And so the stamp tax was to pay for some of that. And we weren't very happy about the stamp tax. You might remember that. Because when we read through the entire Stamp Act, now let me say, that we did fully understand the need for some taxes in order to make the government work. We understood that there were some taxes needed in order to do things like to finance the Navy, to keep our ships, like ships I would hire that would carry my goods, to keep them safe at sea. Things like that, that we knew there were things that had to be done within the empire and that taxes had to be raised to accomplish those. So we were not opposed to all taxes of all types. Plus, we understood that the crown taxed all goods that traveled within the British Empire on British ships, customs. We were used to that, and that was a part of the price we factored into our goods, the cost of our goods, and what we would sell our goods for in our shops. So we were not opposed to all taxes, but we were opposed to this tax because when we sat down and read the full text, we found first that it created a massive government bureaucracy to deal with the tax, right? To impose the tax, to collect the taxes, count the taxes, impose the law against people who didn't pay the taxes. So it created lots of new government positions and jobs. And at the end of this document, it says that any money that was left over after paying for the troops, paying for the bureaucracy, and paying for all that went into the government sinking fund, which I think in your time you might call a slush fund or a discretionary fund, in which the Parliament could spend that money any way they wished. And well, this made it something we call a revenue tax. A revenue tax, a tax that the Parliament raises to pay for anything they want to spend it on. And as British subjects, we could only be taxed for revenue with consent. And since we did not elect anyone to the parliament. Here we said the tax was illegal, that it was no taxation without representation. And I think I have, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I think I have here a picture of the tax being read on the streets of Boston. And you might remember that a great man in Boston, Mr. James Otis, gave a very long speech in the Massachusetts legislature in which he said, taxation without representation is tyranny. And so now everyone began to speak out against the stamp tax. And here in New York, we even had riots over the stamp tax. It got very testy and difficult here as people started getting very angry over this tax that we felt was taking our prosperity, our wealth, and sending it to the parliament for the very wealthy members of parliament to do whatever they chose to do with it. So the stamp tax was very unhappily greeted here in America. And the colonies, for the first time, we united against England because we apparently found something we disliked more than we disliked each other, and united against the Stamp Act. And we all protested no taxation without representation. Well, the protest became so violent that no stamp paper was ever distributed in the colonies. We were very successful at that. None of the governors were brave enough to bring the stamps into America. The stamp tax, though, did still go into effect November 1st of 1765, even though there was no stamp paper to be used. And here in New York, we held a funeral march for the death of Lady Liberty, who died of a cruel stamp to her vitals. And then 200 merchants, my father included, as I was young at that time, too young to attend myself. My father attended a meeting of the Chamber of Commerce in which he and about 200 other merchants signed a unanimous declaration that they would not trade with England unless the Stamp Act was removed. And I'm sure you remember your American history that we all agreed from Maine to Georgia, even though it would be at great economic distress to ourselves, agreed not to trade with England. And this created a terrible economic problem for England. And almost 1 year to the day, in March of 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed, and we got the first taste of our united economic power over the crown. So we were victorious against the Stamp Act. Now, the next tax, of course, England didn't end with the stamp tax. You think they would have said, well, that didn't work out very well. Perhaps we should no longer do this, but they didn't. And we got another tax. And the next tax, you may remember, is the Quartering Act. So in the Parliament, a handful of smart gentlemen said, well, since we are unable to tax you directly for the support of the troops, and you still must pay for that, we will make you tax yourselves. So the Quartering Act, in effect, says that your colonial governments must now tax you for the support of the troops that are housed there. And if you can't raise the tax money, then you must allow the soldiers to live in your homes at your own expense. Wow. Imagine what the people who had young daughters at home thought about that. Would you want these savage British regulars living in your home with your daughters? No, not under any circumstances. So the Quartering Act very quickly became unpopular for that and other reasons, of course, because again, we wanted England to bring the army home to England. We felt that the occupying army would be used not to protect us, but to control us whenever we would come out to protest or oppose the royal officials here. So again, the colonies, we united against the Quartering Act, and we stayed united until the year 1769, at which time we had colonial elections here in New York, and a different political party took over our assembly. At that time, that political party appropriated the money for the troops, and the unity of the colonies was broken. And my friends, we could only stand successfully against England if we remained united. And now New York had broken the unity of the colonies. The other colonies all sent us awful letters. I hear they had a funeral march for New York at the College of New Jersey, which you call Princeton today. And as a result, a good friend who you have heard me talk about on other occasions, Captain Alexander McDougall, wrote a broadside to the betrayed inhabitants of the city and colony of New York, in which he called out the fraudulent elections, which led to the changeover in leadership of the assembly, which then caused the raising of the money for the quartering of the troops and the divisiveness of the colonies. Now, initially, of course, Captain McDougall wrote this anonymously, but eventually he was jailed for it, and he spent 4 months in jail under the charge of seditious libel, simply for telling the truth about fraudulent elections and the Quartering Act. And eventually, the charges were dropped against Captain McDougall, and he went home a hero. Now, others protested against the Quartering Act as well. And what is this one? Oh, that is the Quartering Act. Okay, McDougall. Oh, and here we have the resulting riot in New York over the Quartering Act, the Battle of Golden Hill. While Captain McDougall was in jail, more broadsides appeared talking about the drunken disorderliness of the soldiers, and the soldiers talking about the drunken disorderliness of the Sons of Liberty, which led to this massive riot in January 1770, which we call the Battle of Golden Hill, in which our residents and the soldiers battled each other using swords and bayonets, halberds, axes, rocks, and bricks. We had dozens of serious injuries, but incredibly no deaths. So you can see how the anger between us and England is growing, and it's taking the form of conflict between our gentlemen and the members of the military, the soldiers based here. And here, of course, I'm sure you all know what happened 5 weeks after the Battle of Golden Hill, the Boston Massacre, in which the British troops shot and killed 5 protesters in Boston. Now, this is the wonderful engraving issued by the master Paul Revere, a wonderful piece of propaganda that convinced everyone in the colonies that the soldiers lined up and shot into a peaceful crowd of people. And of course, we know that isn't what happened at all, that it was a terrible riot. The crowd was throwing bottles and rocks at the soldiers, and fearing for their lives, the soldiers shot into the crowd. We know this to be true because the great patriot John Adams defended some of these soldiers at trial and had them found not guilty of murder. But a picture says 1,000 words, and everyone in the colonies believed this is what happened in Boston, and the Crown was now required to back off a little bit on the Quartering Act because the troops fell under such anger because of this result. And here in New York, you know, people who employed the soldiers part-time all began to fire them, would no longer hire them to work in their shops. And the animosities between the people in the town and the soldiers grew to great extent after the Quartering Act. Now, let me remind you that the Boston Massacre here is in 1770, and that is still 5 years before the war would start. So you can see we are gradually getting more and more angry over what's being done. And so the Crown did not fare well with the Quartering Act. But that didn't stop them either, because then we got the Tea Act. Remember the Tea Act of 1773. Now, it has been told to me that you have some misunderstandings in your time about the Tea Act. I believe that many of you think the tea was a tax on tea, making the tea expensive for Americans to buy. It was the reversal of that. It was, as you can see here, it says the drawback of the duties. This removed the duties on some tea, only a specific tea, and that was tea sold by the British East India Company. Now, I've on previous occasions got into the whole financial aspect of the British East India Company at this time, and that they were engaged in what you might call a Ponzi scheme in your time with their trade with China and India. Much of the British economy in 1773 was based on East India Company stock, and Bank of England stock, and various types of investments based on those issuances. And so it was very important that the East India Tea not go out of business. And they found themselves in a position where they did not have the gold to pay their Asian debts. Very bad situation. So they decided, oh, excuse me, I'm itchy tonight. So their friends in Parliament, who of course were the people who financed their campaigns and gave them gifts, and their friends in the Bank of England, who of course financed their campaigns and gave them gifts, convinced the Parliament to withdraw the duties only on the East India tea, making it cheaper than all of the other tea in America, so that they could sell their tea cheaply in America. And this, they said, would help to make up the shortfall for the East India Company. And as you can guess, as soon as we heard about this, there was quite a lot of debate about this. And here I have a whole collection of different headlines and handbills and pamphlets that came out about the Tea Act. And here in New York, we were divided over the Tea Act. There were some who said we should not buy the tea or drink the tea for any reason. But there was a writer here in New York who, by the way, was very intelligent, very eloquent, and wrote a series of broadsides about why we should buy the tea. And he said to us that as British subjects, we are gifted beyond all the other people of the world. We have the protection of the common law. We have the British Army and Navy to protect us, the rule of British Empire, that we enjoy all gifts of the British Empire, and that we are happy to be a part of the British Empire, because here in America we have so much freedom, more freedom than anyone else in the world, while at the same time being under the protection of the crown and the common law. And therefore we should gladly buy the tea, because he said, if the East India Company failed, why, the British Empire would fail, and all that we know would be lost and would be subject to lawlessness and anarchy. So in other words, I think he's saying that if the East India Company were to fail, everything would be lost. Does that make them too big to fail? And I think you have that phrase in your time. I think it's been used in your time. The idea that a company or an entity is so big that if it were to go bankrupt and fail, everything would fall with it, including the British Empire. And of course, here, many of us said that was just nonsense. It was nonsense that we could function fine without the East India Company. And we did not buy the tea. Well, some of the ladies here in New York still bought the tea, but that's a subject for another time. And you know what our friends in Boston did, right? They threw the tea into the harbor. They were so angry about the Tea Act. We would not let ships carrying the tea even come into the harbor. And that's what this is. This is a notice in New York from the Sons of Neptune to the various ship captains to not try to bring any ships into the harbor carrying the East India Company tea. So lots of threats, lots of threatened violence. And if you've not seen it in your time, this is the seal of the East India Company. So this is the arms of the East India Company. And many of you who have been following me for some time know that I have a cartoon that I love very much from the time period that I just adore. And it is this one, with a member of Parliament taking his oath against bribery while accepting a bribe at exactly the same moment from a member of the East India Company. And up on the wall is a list of bribes and their prices. This, my friends, was not printed here in America. This was printed in London in 1774. Everyone knowing, of course, that the Tea Act was all an effort to save the East India Company. So this was not a fantasy on our part here, but certainly a reality that they knew then. Now, at about all of this time that this is going on with the various taxes, and now the final tax, the Tea Act, a ballad appeared here in New York, a ballad written by someone I know. And I won't tell you who he is until the end. It's called An Excellent New Song for the Sons of Liberty in America. And in it, our friend, he calls himself a gentleman from the city of New York, this gentleman says, in story we're told how our fathers of old braved the rage of the wind and the waves, and crossed the deep o'er to this desolate shore, all because they were loath to be slaves, brave boys, because they were loath to be slaves. Yet a strange scheme of late has been formed in this state by a knot of political knaves, who in secret rejoice that the Parliament's voice has condemned us by law to be slaves, brave boys, condemned us by law to be slaves. With the beasts of the wood, we will ramble for food, and we'll lodge in wild deserts and caves, and we'll live poor as Job on the skirts of the globe before we'll submit to be slaves, brave boys, before we'll submit to be slaves. The birthright we hold will never be sold, but sacred maintained to our graves. Nay, in ere we'll comply, we will gallantly die, for we must not and will not be slaves, brave boys. We must not and will not be slaves. And the author is talking about taxation making us slaves to the British aristocracy. That the taxation of our personal wealth was theft. It was criminal, and that it was an organization of criminals in England who used the Parliament to steal from us, and thus slavery, tax slaves. Now, the gentleman who wrote this wonderful ballad is Benjamin Prime from Huntington, Long Island, a graduate of the College of New Jersey or Princeton, also a graduate of Medical College in Amsterdam, fluent in numerous languages, a fine gentleman, author of many pieces of this kind. And he told me that when it became known he was the author, that he was forced to walk around with 2 pistols mounted on his belt in order to defend himself. So I wonder what you think of that idea that taxation is theft. That's certainly what we thought. Taxation is theft. Our view is that the government is a necessary evil. It should be as small as possible, and it should take as little money from you as possible. And you should always, always know what that money is being spent on, as it is yours. I hope you haven't forgotten in the future. So I hope you liked my little talk about taxes, and more taxes. And I hope you don't have too many taxes in your time, as we were able to control it quite well in mine. And I hope I see you all next weekend. I'll be sending out information about my talk in front of the Queens Public Library on Friday morning. You can join me there. That's free for everyone. It is not recorded, so you do have to watch it when it airs. And then, of course, there'll be the tour next Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And I hope you'll join that live, but you will be able to see that anytime, as it will remain on Facebook and YouTube. And I will be dressed up as Mrs. Q, dressed for Halloween. So we'll all have some good fun. Thank you all for joining me. Do you have any questions? I'm here for a couple more minutes if you have any questions or any comments. I am wearing a different outfit. This is some gray and white silk with some golden silk threads in it. It's very pretty, and it's not really being picked up on the camera as well as I would like, but it is a very pretty, and it's a little heavy. I wore wool tonight because it's a little cool here, but it's a little warmer than I expected. So thank you all. I hope you all have a healthy and a nice week, and I will see you all again, I hope, next weekend. Have a wonderful night, and I'll see you next week. Thank you for joining me. From the McCabe's. It's good to see you also, Mr. and Mrs. McCabe, and I hope you'll be joining me live on Sunday because I will be interested in your comments. By the way, if you join live on Sunday for the graveyard tour, I will see your comments. Mr. Q, as usual, will be behind the camera, and he will relay any of your questions and comments to me. And if you come live, of course, you'll get to meet Mr. Q. He will be there behind the camera. So thank you all very much, and I will see you all next week. It's great to be back. Thank you very much for joining me.